Chapter 17. Episodes of the Persecutions, continuation of Eliza R. Snow's narrative, Bathsheba W. Smith's story, Louisa F. Wells introduced to the reader, experience of Abigail Leonard, Margaret Fouts. The prophet and his brother Hiram were in prison and in chains in Missouri. Sidney Rigdon, Parley Pratt, and others were also in prison and in chains for the gospel's sake. The St. Peter of Mormondom was engaged in removing the saints from Missouri to Illinois. He had made a covenant with them that none of the faithful should be left. Faithfully he kept that covenant. It was then, in fact, that Brigham rose as a great leader of a people, giving promise of what he has been since the martyrdom of the prophet. While Joseph is in chains and Brigham is accomplishing the exodus from Missouri, the sisters shall relate some episodes of those days. Sister Snow, continuing the thread of her narrative already given, says, "In Kirtland the persecution increased until many had to flee for their lives, and in the spring of 1838, in company with my father, mother, 3 brothers, 1 sister, and her 2 daughters, I left Kirtland and arrived in Far West, Caldwell County, Mo. on the 16th of July, where I stopped at the house of Sidney Rigdon with my brother Lorenzo, who was very sick, while the rest of the family went farther and settled in Adamondiaman in Davies County. In 2 weeks, my brother being sufficiently recovered, my father sent for us and we joined the family group. My father purchased the premises of 2 of the old settlers and paid their demands in full. I mention this because subsequent events proved that, at the time of the purchase, although those men ostensibly were our warm friends, they had, in connection with others of the same stripe, concocted plans to mob and drive us from our newly acquired homes and repossess them. In this brief biographical sketch, I shall not attempt a review of the scenes that followed. Sufficient to say, while we were busy in making preparations for the approaching winter, to our great surprise, those neighbors fled from the place, as if driven by a mob, leaving their clocks ticking, dishes spread for their meal, coffee pots boiling, etc., etc., and, as they went, spread the report in every direction that the Mormons had driven them from their homes, arousing the inhabitants of the surrounding country, which resulted in the disgraceful, notorious, exterminating order from the governor of the state. In accordance therewith, we left Davies County for that of Caldwell, preparatory to fulfilling the injunction of leaving the state before grass grows in the spring. The clemency of our law-abiding, citizen-expelling governor allowed us 10 days to leave our county, and, till the expiration of that term, a posse of militia was to guard us against mobs, but it would be very difficult to tell which was better, the militia or the mob. Nothing was too mean for the militia to perform. No property was safe within the reach of those men. One morning, while we were hard at work, preparing for our exit, the former occupant of our house entered, and in an impudent and arrogant manner inquired how soon we should be out of it. My American blood warmed to the temperature of an insulted, freeborn citizen, as I looked at him, and thought, poor man, you little think with whom you have to deal, God lives. He certainly overruled in that instance, for those wicked men never got possession of that property, although my father sacrificed it to American mobocracy. In assisting widows and others who required help, my father's time was so occupied that we did not start until the morning of the 10th and last day of the allotted grace. The weather was very cold and the ground covered with snow. After assisting in the arrangements for the journey and shivering with cold, in order to warm my aching feet, I walked until the teams overtook me. In the meantime, I met one of the so-called militia, who accosted me with, "Well, I think this will cure you of your faith." Looking him steadily in the eye, I replied, "No, sir, it will take more than this to cure me of my faith." His countenance suddenly fell, and he responded, "I must confess, you are a better soldier than I am." I passed on, thinking that, unless he was above the average of his fellows in that section, I was not highly complimented by his confession. It is true our hardships and privations were sufficient to have disheartened any but the saints of the living God, those who were prompted by higher than earthly motives and trusting in the arm of Jehovah. We were 2 days on our way to Far West, and stopped overnight at what was called the halfway house, a log building perhaps 20 feet square, with the chinkings between the logs, minus, they probably having been burned for firewood, the owner of the house, Brother Littlefield, having left with his family to escape being robbed, and the north wind had free ingress through the openings, wide enough for cats to crawl through. This had been the lodging place of the hundreds who had preceded us, and on the present occasion proved the almost shelterless shelter of 75 or 80 souls. To say lodging would be a hoax, although places were allotted to a few aged and feeble to lie down, while the rest of us either sat or stood, or both, all night. My sister and I managed so that Mother lay down, and we sat by, on the floor, of course, to prevent her being trampled on, for the crowd was such that people were hardly responsible for their movements. It was past the middle of December, and the cold was so intense that, in spite of well packing, our food was frozen hard, bread and all, and although a blazing fire was burning on one side of the room, we could not get to it to thaw our suppers, and had to resort to the next expediency, which was this. The boys milked, and while one strained the milk, another held the pan, for there was no chance for putting anything down. Then, while one held a bowl of the warm milk, another would, as expeditiously as possible, thinly slice the frozen bread into it. And thus we managed for supper. In the morning, we were less crowded, as some started very early, and we toasted our bread and thawed our meat before the fire. But withal, that was a very merry night. None but saints can be happy under every circumstance. About 20 feet from the house was a shed, in the center of which the brethren built a roaring fire, around which some of them stood and sang songs and hymns all night, while others parched corn and roasted frosted potatoes, etc. Not a complaint was heard, all were cheerful, and judging from appearances, strangers would have taken us to be pleasure excursionists rather than a band of gubernatorial exiles. After the mobbing commenced, although my father had purchased, and had on hand, plenty of wheat, he could get none ground, and we were under the necessity of grating corn for our bread on graters made of tin pails and stovepipe. I will here insert a few extracts from a long poem I wrote while in Davies County as follows. 'Twas autumn. Summer's melting breath was gone, and winter's gelid blast was stealing on. To meet its dread approach with anxious care, the houseless saints were struggling to prepare, when round about a desperate mob arose, like tigers waking from a night's repose. They came like hordes from nether shades let loose, men without hearts, just fit for Satan's use. With wild, demoniac rage they sallied forth, resolved to drive the saints of God from earth. Hemmed in by foes, deprived the use of mill, necessity inspires their patient skill. Tin pails and stovepipe, from their service torn, are changed to graters to prepare the corn, that nature's wants may barely be supplied. They ask no treat, no luxury beside. But where their shelter? Winter hastens fast. Can tents and wagons stem this northern blast? The scene presented in the city of Far West, as we stopped overnight on our way to our temporary location, was too important to be omitted and too sad to narrate. Joseph Smith and many other prominent men had been dragged to prison. Their families, having been plundered, were nearly or quite destitute, some living on parched corn, others on boiled wheat, and desolation seemed inscribed on everything but the hearts of the faithful saints. In the midst of affliction, they trusted in God. After spending the remainder of the winter in the vicinity of Far West, on the 5th of March, 1839, leaving much of our property behind, we started for Illinois. From the commencement of hostilities against us in the state of Missouri till our expulsion, no sympathy in our behalf was ever, to my knowledge, expressed by any of the former citizens, with one single exception, and that was so strikingly in contrast with the morbid state of feeling generally manifested that it made a deep impression on my mind, and I think it worthy of record. I will here relate the circumstance. It occurred on our outward journey. After a night of rain which turned to snow and covered the ground in the morning, we thawed our tent, which was stiffly frozen, by holding and turning it alternately before a blazing fire until it could be folded for packing, and, all things put in order, while we all shook with the cold, we started on. As the sun mounted upwards, the snow melted and increased the depth of the mud with which the road before us had been amply stocked, and rendered travel almost impossible. The teams were puffing and the wagons dragging so heavily that we were all on foot, tugging along as best we could, when an elderly gentleman, on horseback, overtook us and, after riding alongside for some time, apparently absorbed in deep thought, as he, after inquiring who we were, watched the women and girls, men and boys, teams and wagons, slowly wending our way up a long hill, en route from our only earthly homes, and, not knowing where we should find one, he said emphatically, "If I were in your places, I should want the governor of the state hitched at the head of my teams." I afterwards remarked to my father that I had not heard as sensible a speech from a stranger since entering the state. I never saw that gentleman afterwards, but have from that time cherished a filial respect for him, and fancy I see his resemblance in the portrait of Sir Von Humboldt, now hanging on the wall before me. We arrived in Quincy, Illinois, where many of the exiled saints had preceded us, and all were received with generous hospitality. My father moved to one of the northern counties. I stopped in Quincy and, while there, wrote for the press an appeal to the citizens of the United States, an address to the citizens of Quincy, and several other articles, for which I received some very flattering encomiums, with solicitations for effusions which, probably, were elicited by the fact that they were from the pen of a Mormon girl. From Quincy, my sister, her 2 daughters, and I went to Lima, Hancock County, where we found a temporary home under the roof of an old veteran of the Revolution, who, with his family, treated us with much kindness, although, through ignorance of the character of the saints, their feelings were like gall towards them as a people, which we knew to be the result of misrepresentation. It was very annoying to our feelings to hear bitter aspersions against those whom we knew to be the best people on earth, but, occupying, as we did, an upper room with a slight flooring between us and those below, we were obliged to hear. Frequently, after our host had introduced our people, of whom he knew nothing, he would suddenly change his tone and boast of the noble women he had in his house, no better women ever lived, etc., which he would have said of the Mormon people generally, had he known them as well. We were pilgrims, and for the time being had to submit to circumstances. Almost anything is preferable to dependence. With these people we would earn our support at the tailoring business, thanks to my mother's industrial training, for which I even now bless her dear memory. In May the saints commenced gathering in Commerce, afterwards Nauvoo, and on the 16th of July I left our kind host and hostess, much to their regret, Elder Rigdon having sent for me to teach his family school in Commerce, and, although I regretted to part with my sister, I was truly thankful to be again associated with the body of the Church, with those whose minds, freed from the fetters of sectarian creeds and man-made theology, launch forth in the divine path of investigation into the glorious fields of celestial knowledge and intelligence. Concerning these times, Sister Bathsheba W. Smith says, "When I was in my 16th year, some Latter-day Saint elders visited our neighborhood. I heard them preach and believed what they taught. I believed the Book of Mormon to be a divine record, and that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. I knew by the Spirit of the Lord, which I received in answer to prayer, that these things were true. On the 21st of August, 1837, I was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints by Elder Samuel James, in Jones Run, on the farm and near the residence of Augustus Burgess, and was confirmed by Elder Francis G. Bishop. The Spirit of the Lord rested upon me, and I knew that he accepted of me as a member in his kingdom. My mother was baptized the same day. My sister Sarah, next older than me, was baptized 3 days previously. My father and my 2 oldest sisters, Matilda and Nancy, together with their husbands, Colonel John S. Martin and Josiah W. Fleming, were baptized into the same church soon afterwards. My uncle, Jacob Bigler, and his family had been baptized a few weeks before. A part of my first experience as a member of the church was that most of my young acquaintances and companions began to ridicule us. The spirit of gathering with the saints in Missouri came upon me, and I became very anxious indeed to go there that fall with my sister Nancy and family, as they had sold out and were getting ready to go. I was told I could not go. This caused me to retire to bed one night feeling very sorrowful. While pondering upon what had been said to me about not going, a voice said to me, "Weep not, you will go this fall." I was satisfied and comforted. The next morning I felt contented and happy, on observing which my sister Sarah said, "You have got over feeling badly about not going to Zion this fall, have you?" I quietly, but firmly replied, "I am going, you will see." My brother, Jacob G. Bigler, having gone to Far West, Mo., joined the church there and bought a farm for my father, and then returned. About this time my father sold his farm in West Virginia and fitted out my mother, my brother, and my sister Sarah, Melissa, and myself, and we started for Far West in company with my two brothers-in-law and my uncle and their families. Father stayed to settle up his business, intending to join us at Far West in the spring, bringing with him, by water, farming implements, house furniture, etc. On our journey, the young folks of our party had much enjoyment. It seemed so novel and romantic to travel in wagons over hill and dale, through dense forests and over extensive prairies, and occasionally passing through towns and cities, and camping in tents at night. On arriving in Missouri, we found the state preparing to wage war against the Latter-day Saints. The nearer we got to our destination, the more hostile the people were. As we were traveling along, numbers of men would sometimes gather around our wagons and stop us. They would inquire who we were, where we were from, and where we were going to. On receiving answers to their questions, they would debate among themselves whether to let us go or not. Their debate would result generally in a statement to the effect of, "As you are Virginians, we will let you go on, but we believe you will soon return, for you will quickly become convinced of your folly." Just before we crossed Grand River, we camped overnight with a company of Eastern Saints. We had a meeting and rejoiced together. In the morning it was thought best for the companies to separate and cross the river by two different ferries, as this arrangement would enable all to cross in less time. Our company arrived at Far West in safety. But not so with the other company. They were overtaken at Hans Mill by an armed mob. 19 were killed, many others were wounded, and some of them maimed for life. 3 nights after we had arrived at the farm which my brother had bought, and which was 4 miles south of the city of Far West, word came that a mob was gathering on Crooked River, and a call was made for men to go out in command of Captain David W. Patton, for the purpose of trying to stop the depredations of the men who were whipping and otherwise maltreating our brethren, and who were destroying and burning property. Captain Patton's company went, and a battle ensued. Some of the Latter-day Saints were killed, and several were wounded. I saw Brother James Hendricks, one of the wounded, as he was being carried home. He was entirely helpless and nearly speechless. Soon afterwards, Captain David W. Patton, who was one of the 12 apostles, was brought wounded into the house where we were. I heard him bear testimony to the truth of Mormonism. He exhorted his wife and all present to abide in the faith. His wife asked him if he had anything against anyone. He answered, no. Elder Heber C. Kimball asked him if he would remember him when he got home. He said he would. Soon after this he died, without a struggle. In this state I saw thousands of mobbers arrayed against the saints, and I heard their shouts and savage yells when our prophet Joseph and his brethren were taken into their camp. I saw much, very much, of the sufferings that were brought upon our people by those lawless men. The saints were forced to sign away their property and to agree to leave the state before it was time to put in spring crops. In these distressing times, the Spirit of the Lord was with us to comfort and sustain us, and we had a sure testimony that we were being persecuted for the gospel's sake, and that the Lord was angry with none save those who acknowledged not his hand in all things. My father had to lose what he had paid on his farm, and in February 1839, in the depth of winter, our family and thousands of the saints were on the way to the state of Illinois. On this journey I walked many a mile to let some poor sick or weary soul ride. At night we would meet around the campfire and take pleasure in singing the songs of Zion, trusting in the Lord that all would yet be well and that Zion would eventually be redeemed. In the spring, Father joined us at Quincy, Illinois. We also had the joy of having our prophet, Joseph Smith, and his brethren restored to us from their imprisonment in Missouri. Many, however, had died from want and exposure during our journey. I was sick for a long time with ague and fever, during which time my father was taken severely sick and died after suffering 7 weeks. It was the first sickness that either of us ever had. In the spring of 1840, our family moved to Nauvoo, in Illinois. Here I continued my punctuality in attending meetings, had many opportunities of hearing Joseph Smith preach, and tried to profit by his instructions, and received many testimonials to the truth of the doctrines he taught. Meetings were held out of doors in pleasant weather, and in private houses when it was unfavorable. I was present at the laying of the cornerstones of the foundation of the Nauvoo Temple, and had become acquainted with the prophet Joseph and his family. On the 25th of July, 1841, I was united in holy marriage to George Albert Smith, the then youngest member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and first cousin of the prophet, Elder Don Carlos Smith, officiating at our marriage. My husband was born June 26, 1817, at Potsdam, St. Lawrence County, N.Y. When I became acquainted with him in Virginia, in 1837, he was the junior member of the first Quorum of 70. On the 26th day of June, 1838, he was ordained a member of the High Council of Adamondiaman, Daviess County, Missouri. Just about the break of day, on the 26th of April, 1839, while kneeling on the cornerstone of the foundation of the Lord's house in the city of Far West, Caldwell County, Missouri, he was ordained one of the 12 apostles. 2 days after we were married, we started, carpet bag in hand, to go to his father's, who lived at Zarahemla, Iowa Territory, about a mile from the Mississippi. There we found a feast prepared for us, in partaking of which my husband's father, John Smith, drank our health, pronouncing the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob upon us. I did not understand the import of this blessing as well then as I do now. Here we meet another of these Spartan women of Mormondom in the person of Louisa F. Wells, the senior wife of Lieutenant General Daniel H. Wells. In July 1837, her father, Absalom Free, who had embraced Mormonism in Fayetteville, St. Clair County, Illinois, in the year 1835, emigrated with his family to Caldwell County, Mo. In Caldwell, Brother Free purchased a farm and built a good house. He was of the well-to-do farmer class. With his ample means, he soon collected a fine farming outfit, and before him was the promise of great prosperity. The Saints had been driven out of Jackson County, and mobs were ravaging in Daviess County, but there was peace in Caldwell until the 4th of July, in 1838, when the anti-Mormons, who were waiting and watching for a pretext, took occasion from some remarks made by Elder Sidney Rigdon in a commemorative speech at the celebration, to commence a crusade against the city of Far West. When the father of Louisa joined the organization for defense of the city of Far West, he left a sick son at home, with the women folks of his own and 5 other families who had gathered there. These were left to defend their homes. Louisa and her sister Emmeline, with their cousin Eliza Free, stood guard on a ridge near the house for 3 weeks, night and day, to warn the families of the approach of the mob. This sister Emmeline is the same who was afterwards so well known in Utah as the wife of Brigham Young. While thus standing guard, one day, the girls saw a troop of horsemen near, marching with a red flag and the beating of drums. They had with them a prisoner on foot, whom they were thus triumphantly marching to their camp. They were a troop of the mob. The prisoner was Grandfather Andrew Free, though at the time the sisters knew it not. It was almost night. The horsemen made direct for their camp with their prisoner of war, whom they had taken, not in arms, for he was aged, yet was he a soldier of the cross, ready to die for his faith. Already had the veteran disciple been doomed by his captors. He was to be shot. One escape only had they reserved for him. Before the mob tribunal stood the old man, calm and upright in his integrity and resolved in his faith. No one was near to succor him. He stood alone, face to face with death, with those stern, cruel men whose class had shown so little mercy in Missouri, massacring men, women and children at Hans Mill and elsewhere about the same time. Then the captain and his band demanded of the old man that he should swear there and then to renounce Joe Smith and his D.D. religion, or they would shoot him on the spot. Drawing himself up with a lofty mien and the invincible courage that the Mormons have always shown in their persecutions, the veteran answered, "I have not long to live. At the worst you cannot deprive me of many days. I will never betray or deny my faith which I know to be of God. Here is my breast. Shoot away, I am ready to die for my religion." At this he bared his bosom and calmly waited for the mob to fire. But the band was abashed at his fearless bearing and answer. For a time the captain and his men consulted, and then they told their prisoner that they had decided to give him till the morning to reconsider whether he would retract his faith or die. Morning came. Again the old man was before the tribunal, fearless in the cause of his religion as he had been the previous night. Again came from him a similar answer, and then he looked for death, indeed, the next moment. But he had conquered his captors, and the leader declared, with an oath, "Any man who can be so D.D. true to any D.D. religion deserves to live." Thereupon the mob released the heroic disciple of Mormonism, and he returned to his home in safety. During the 3 weeks the girls stood on guard, their father, who was desirous to get tidings of his sick son, came frequently to a thicket of underbrush, where the girls would bring his food and communicate with him concerning affairs at the house. One evening during the season of guard duty, the girls discovered 5 armed men approaching. Running to the house, they gave the alarm. In a few moments, every woman and child of the 6 families were hiding in the neighboring cornfield, excepting Louisa, her mother, and her sick brother. "Mother," said the boy, "you and Louisa run and hide. The mob will be sure to kill me. They will see how tall I am by the bedclothes and will think I am a man. You and Sister Louisa escape, or they will kill you too." But the mother resolved to share the fate of her son, unless she could protect him by her presence, and soften the hearts of savage mobocrats by a mother's prayers for mercy, but she bade her daughter fly with the baby. Louisa, however, also determined to stay to defend both her brother and her mother. So they armed themselves, the mother with an axe, and Louisa with a formidable pair of old-fashioned fire tongs, and stationed themselves at either door. But it turned out that the men were a squad of friends, whom the father had sent to inquire after his family. Yet the incident illustrates those days of universal terror for the Mormons in the state of Missouri. Worse, even, than the horrors of ordinary war must it have been, when thus women, children, and the sick, when not a Mormon man was present to provoke the mob to bloodshed, looked for massacre upon massacre as daily scenes which all in turn might expect to overtake them. After the fall of the city of Far West, it being decided that the Mormons should make a grand exodus from Missouri in the spring, Mr. Free determined to anticipate it. Gathering up what property he could save from the sacrifice, he started with his family for Illinois, abandoning the beautiful farm he had purchased and paid for, along with the improvements he had made. In their flight to Illinois, they were frequently overtaken and threatened by mobs, but fortunately escaped personal violence, as it was evident they were hastening from the inhospitable state. But the inhumanity of the Missourians in those times is well illustrated in the following incident. Along with Brother Free's party were William Duncan and Solomon Allen, whose feet were so badly frozen one day that they were unable to proceed. At every house on the route the exiles called, soliciting permission to shelter and care for the disabled men, but at every place they were turned away, until at last, at 11 o'clock at night, they were graciously permitted to occupy some Negro quarters. The grace, however, of Missouri was redeemed by a codicil that no D.D. Mormon should stop among white folks. This was mercy, indeed, for Missouri, and it is written in the Book of Remembrance. The party stopped and occupied the Negro quarters, nursing the men during the night, and so far restored them that they were enabled to go on the next day. Arriving at the Mississippi River, above St. Charles, it was found that the ice was running so fiercely that it was well-nigh impossible to cross, but the mobbers insisted that they should cross at once. The crossing was made on a scow ferryboat, common in those times, and as the boat was near being swamped in the current, to add to the horror of the incident, it was seriously proposed by the boatmen to throw some of the D.D. Mormons overboard to lighten the load. The proposition, however, was abandoned, and the party landed safely on the opposite shore. Having escaped all the perils of that flight from Missouri, Father Free and his family made their home in the more hospitable state of Illinois, where the Mormons for a season found their second Zion. Here we leave Sister Louisa, for a while, to meet her again in the grand exodus of her people from civilization. The following experience of Abigail Leonard, a venerable and respected lady, now in her 82nd year of life, will also be of interest in this connection. She says, "In 1829 Eleazar Miller came to my house for the purpose of holding up to us the light of the gospel and to teach us the necessity of a change of heart. He did not teach creedism, for he did not believe therein. That night was a sleepless one to me, for all night long I saw before me our Savior nailed to the cross. I had not yet received remission of my sins, and, in consequence thereof, was much distressed. These feelings continued for several days, till one day, while walking alone in the street, I received the light of the Spirit. Not long after this, several Associated Methodists stopped at our house, and in the morning, while I was preparing breakfast, they were conversing upon the subject of church matters and the best places for church organization. From the jottings of their conversation, which I caught from time to time, I saw that they cared more for the fleece than the flock. The Bible lay on the table nearby, and as I passed I occasionally read a few words until I was impressed with the question, what is it that separates two Christians? For 2 or 3 weeks this question was constantly on my mind, and I read the Bible and prayed that this question might be answered to me. One morning I took my Bible and went to the woods, when I fell upon my knees and exclaimed, "Now, Lord, I pray for the answer of this question, and I shall never rise till you reveal to me what it is that separates two Christians." Immediately a vision passed before my eyes, and the different sects passed one after another by me, and a voice called to me, saying, "These are built up for gain." Then, beyond, I could see a great light, and a voice from above called out, "I shall raise up a people, whom I shall delight to own and bless." I was then fully satisfied, and returned to the house. Not long after this a meeting was held at our house, during which everyone was invited to speak, and when opportunity presented, I arose and said, "Today I come out from all names, sects and parties, and take upon myself the name of Christ, resolved to wear it to the end of my days." For several days afterward, many people came from different denominations and endeavored to persuade me to join their respective churches. At length the Associated Methodists sent their presiding elder to our house to preach, in the hope that I might be converted. While the elder was discoursing, I beheld a vision in which I saw a great multitude of people in the distance, and over their heads hung a thick, dark cloud. Now and then one of the multitude would struggle, and rise up through the gloomy cloud, but the moment his head rose into the light above, the minister would strike him a blow, which would compel him to retire, and I said in my heart, "They will never serve me so." Not long after this, I heard of the Book of Mormon, and when a few of us were gathered at a neighbor's we asked that we might have manifestations in proof of the truth and divine origin of this book, although we had not yet seen it. Our neighbor, a lady, was quite sick and in much distress. It was asked that she be healed, and immediately her pain ceased, and health was restored. Brother Bowen defiantly asked that he might be slain, and in an instant he was prostrated upon the floor. I requested that I might know of the truth of this book, by the gift and power of the Holy Ghost, and I immediately felt its presence. Then, when the Book of Mormon came, we were ready to receive it and its truths. The brethren gathered at our house to read it, and such days of rejoicing and thanksgiving I never saw before nor since. We were now ready for baptism, and on or about the 20th of August, 1831, were baptized. When we heard of the gathering, we were ready for that also, and began preparations for the journey. On the 3d of July, 1832, we started for Jackson County, Mo., where we arrived sometime in the latter part of December of the same year. Here we lived in peace and enjoyed the blessings of our religion till the spring of 1833, when the mob came upon us and shed its terror in our midst. The first attack was made upon Independence, about 12 miles from our place. The printing press was destroyed and the type scattered in the streets. Other buildings and their furniture were destroyed, and Bishop Partridge was tarred and feathered. Next, we heard that the enemy had attacked our brethren in the woods about 6 miles distant. Then my husband was called upon to go and assist his brethren. He arrived on the field in the heat of the battle and received 14 bullet holes in his garments, but received no wounds, save 2 very slight marks, one on the hip, the other on the arm. The mob was defeated, and my husband returned home for food. I gave it him and bade him secrete himself immediately. He did so, and none too soon, for scarcely was he hidden when the mob appeared. As soon as my husband was secreted, I took my children and went to a neighbor's house, where the sisters were gathering for safety. About this time, Sister Parley Pratt was being helped from a sick bed to this place of security, and the mob, seeing the sisters laboring to carry her, gave their assistance and carried her in. The mob then searched for firearms, but could find none. The brethren and the mob formed a treaty about this time, in which we agreed to abandon the country by a specified time. Immediately our people commenced moving across the Missouri River into Clay County. The people of Clay County, becoming alarmed at our numbers and incited to malice by the people of Jackson County, cut away the boat before all our people had crossed, and thus compelled our family with some others to remain in Jackson County. There were 9 families in all. And the mob came and drove us out into the prairie before the bayonet. It was in the cold, cheerless month of November, and our first night's camp was made the 13th of that month, so wide-famed as the night of falling stars. The next day we continued our journey over cold, frozen, barren prairie ground, many of our party barefoot and stockingless, feet and legs bleeding. Mine was the only family whose feet were clothed, and that day, while alone, I asked the Lord what I should do, and his answer was, "Divide among the sufferers, and thou shalt be repaid fourfold." I then gave till I had given more than 15 pairs of stockings. In 3.5 days from the time of starting, we arrived at a grove of timber near a small stream, where we encamped for the winter. From the time of our arrival till the following February, we lived like saints. For a while our men were permitted to return to the settlements in Jackson County and haul away the provisions which they had left behind, but at last they would neither sell to us nor allow us any longer to return for our own provisions left behind. A meeting was held, and it was decided that but one thing was left to do, which was to return to Jackson County, to the place we had recently left from compulsion. This we did, and on the evening of February 20th, 1834, soon after our arrival in the old deserted place, we had been to meeting and returned. It was about 11 o'clock at night, while we were comfortably seated around a blazing fire, built in an old-fashioned Dutch fireplace, when someone on going out discovered a crowd of men at a little distance from the house on the hill. This alarmed the children, who ran out, leaving the door open. In a moment or two 5 armed men pushed their way into the house and presented their guns to my husband's breast and demanded, "Are you a Mormon?" My husband replied, "I profess to belong to the Church of Christ." They then asked if he had any arms, and on being told that he had not, one of them said, "Now, DNU, walk outdoors." My husband was standing up and did not move. Seeing that he would not go, one of them laid down his gun, clutched a chair, and dealt a fierce blow at my husband's head, but fortunately the chair struck a beam overhead, which turned and partially stopped the force of the blow, and it fell upon the side of his head and shoulder with too little force to bring him down, yet enough to smash the chair in pieces upon the hearth. The fiend then caught another chair, with which he succeeded in knocking my husband down beneath the stairway. They then struck him several blows with a chair-post upon the head, cutting 4 long gashes in the scalp. The infuriated men then took him by the feet and dragged him from the room. They raised him to his feet, and one of them, grasping a large boulder, hurled it with full force at his head, but he dropped his head enough to let the stone pass over, and it went against the house like a cannonball. Several of them threw him into the air and brought him, with all their might, at full length upon the ground. When he fell, one of them sprang upon his breast, and stamping with all his might, broke 2 of his ribs. They then turned him upon his side, and with a chairpost dealt him many severe blows upon the thigh, which were heard at a distance of 120 rods. Next they tore off his coat and shirt and proceeded to whip him with their gunsticks. I had been by my husband during this whole affray, and one of the mob, seeing me, cried out, "Take that woman in the house, or she will overpower every devil of you." 4 of them presented their guns to my breast, and jumping off the ground with rage, uttering the most tremendous oaths, they commanded me to go into the house. This order I did not obey, but hastened to my husband's assistance, taking stick after stick from them, till I must have thrown away 20. By this time my husband felt that he could hold out no longer, and raising his hands toward heaven, asking the Lord to receive his spirit, he fell to the ground, helpless. Every hand was stayed, and I asked a sister who was in the house to assist me to carry him indoors. We carried him in, and after washing his face and making him as comfortable as possible, I went forth into the mob, and reasoned with them, telling them that my husband had never harmed one of them, nor raised his arm in defense against them. They then went calmly away, but next day circulated a report that they had killed one Mormon. After the mob had gone, I sent for the elder, and he, with 2 or 3 of the brethren, came and administered to my husband, and he was instantly healed. The gashes on his head grew together without leaving a scar, and he went to bed comfortable. In the morning I combed the coagulated blood out of his hair, and he was so well that he went with me to meeting that same day. The mob immediately held a meeting and informed us that we were to have only 3 days to leave in, and if we were not off by that time the whole party would be massacred. We accordingly prepared to leave, and by the time appointed were on our way to Clay County. Soon after our arrival in Clay County, the camp of Zion came, and located about 20 miles from us. The cholera broke out in the camp, and many died. 3 of the parties started to where we lived, but 2 died on the way, leaving Mr. Martin Harris to accomplish the journey alone. The first thing, when he saw me, he exclaimed, "Sister Leonard, I came to your house to save my life." For 8 days my husband and I worked with him before he began to show signs of recovery, scarcely lying down to take our rest. While Mr. Harris was lying sick, the prophet Joseph Smith came, with 11 others, to visit him. This was the first time I had ever seen the prophet. The prophet advised us to scatter out over the county and not congregate too much together, so that the people would have no cause for alarm. While we were yet living in this place, the ague came upon my family, and my husband lay sick for 5 months and the children for 3. During the whole time I procured my own wood and never asked anyone for assistance. On the recovery of my husband, he bought a beautiful little farm nearby, where we lived long enough to raise 1 crop, when the mob again came against us, and we were compelled to move into Caldwell County. When we arrived there, we moved into a log cabin, without door, window, or fireplace, where my husband left the children and me, and returned to Clay County, for some of the brethren who were left behind. During his absence, a heavy snowstorm came, and we were without wood or fire. My little boy and I, by turns, cut wood enough to keep us warm till my husband returned. Here my husband entered 80 acres of land, and subsequently bought an additional 20 acres. Here, too, we stayed long enough to raise 1 crop, and then moved to Nauvoo, Hancock County, Illinois. As soon as we were located, we were all seized with sickness, and scarcely had I recovered, when there came into our midst some brethren from England who were homeless, and our people took them in with their own families. One of the families we took to live with us. The woman was sick, and we sent for the elders to heal her, but their endeavors were not successful, and I told the husband of the sick woman that but one thing was left to be done, which was to send for the sisters. The sisters came, washed, anointed, and administered to her. The patient's extremities were cold, her eyes set, a spot in the back apparently mortified, and every indication that death was upon her. But before the sisters had ceased to administer, the blood went coursing through her system and to her extremities, and she was sensibly better. Before night her appetite returned and became almost insatiable, so much so at least that, after I had given her to eat all I dared, she became quite angry because I would not give her more. In 3 days, she sat up and had her hair combed and soon recovered. The following portion of Margaret Fouts's narrative will also be of interest in this connection. She says, "I am the daughter of David and Mary Munn and was born December 11th, 1801, in Franklin County, Pa. I was married to Jacob Fouts, July 22d, 1822. In the year 1827, we emigrated to Richland County, Ohio. After living here a few years, an elder by the name of David Evans came into the neighborhood, preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, commonly called Mormonism. We united ourselves with the church, being baptized by Brother Evans in the year 1834. Subsequently, we took our departure for Missouri to gather with the saints. We purchased some land to make a permanent home on Crooked River, where a small branch of the church was organized, David Evans being the president. We enjoyed ourselves exceedingly well, and everything seemed to prosper, but the spirit of persecution soon began to make itself manifest. Falsehoods were circulated about the Mormon population that were settling about that region, and there soon began to be signs of trouble. The brethren, in order to protect their families, organized themselves together. Threats being made by the mob to destroy a mill belonging to Brother Hown, it was considered best to have a few men continually at the mill to protect it. One day Brother Evans went and had an interview with a Mr. Comstock, said to be the head man of the mob. All things were amicably adjusted. Brother Evans then went to inform the brethren, my husband being among them, that all was well. This was about the middle of the afternoon, when Brother Evans returned from Mr. Comstock's. On a sudden, without any warning whatever, 60 or 70 men, with blackened faces, came riding their horses at full speed. The brethren ran, for protection, into an old blacksmith shop, they being without arms. The mob rode up to the shop, and without any explanation or apparent cause, began a wholesale butchery, by firing round after round through the cracks between the logs of the shop. I was at home with my family of 5 little children and could hear the firing. In a moment I knew the mob was upon us. Soon a runner came, telling the women and children to hasten into the timber and secrete themselves, which we did, without taking anything to keep us warm, and had we been fleeing from the scalping knife of the Indian we would not have made greater haste. And as we ran from house to house, gathering as we went, we finally numbered about 40 or 50 women and children. We ran about 3 miles into the woods, and there huddled together, spreading what few blankets or shawls we chanced to have on the ground for the children, and here we remained until 2 o'clock the next morning, before we heard anything of the result of the firing at the mill. Who can imagine our feelings during this dreadful suspense? And when the news did come, oh, what terrible news! Fathers, brothers, and sons, inhumanly butchered. We now took up the line of march for home. Alas! What a home! Who would we find there? And now, with our minds full of the most fearful forebodings, we retraced those 3 long, dreary miles. As we were returning, I saw a brother, Myers, who had been shot through his body. In that dreadful state, he crawled on his hands and knees about 2 miles to his home. After I arrived at my house with my children, I hastily made a fire to warm them and then started for the mill, about 1 mile distant. My children would not remain at home, saying, if father and mother are going to be killed, we want to be with them. It was about 7 o'clock in the morning when we arrived at the mill. In the first house I came to there were 3 dead men. One, a Brother McBride, I was told was a survivor of the Revolution. He was a terrible sight to behold, having been cut and chopped and horribly mangled with a corn cutter. I hurried on, looking for my husband. I found him in an old house, covered with some rubbish. The mob had taken the bedding and clothing from all the houses near the mill. My husband had been shot in the thigh. I rendered him all the assistance I could, but it was evening before I could get him home. I saw 13 more dead bodies at the shop, and witnessed the beginning of the burial, which consisted in throwing the bodies into an old, dry well. So great was the fear of the men that the mob would return and kill what few of them there were left, that they threw the bodies in, head first or feet first, as the case might be. When they had thrown in 3, my heart sickened, and I turned fainting away. At the moment of the massacre, my husband and another brother drew some of the dead bodies on themselves and pretended to be dead also, by so doing saving their lives. While in this situation, they heard what the ruffians said after the firing was over. Two little boys, who had not been hit, begged for their lives, but with horrible oaths they put the muzzles of their guns to the children's heads and blew their brains out. Oh! What a change one short day had brought. Here were my friends, dead and dying. One in particular asked me to give him relief by taking a hammer and knocking his brains out, so great was his agony. And we knew not what moment our enemies would be upon us again. And all this, not because we had broken any law, on the contrary, it was a part of our religion to keep the laws of the land. In the evening, Brother Evans got a team and conveyed my husband to his house, carried him in and placed him on a bed. I then had to attend him alone, without any doctor or anyone to tell me what to do. 6 days afterwards I, with my husband's assistance, extracted the bullet, it being buried deep in the thick part of the thigh, and flattened like a knife. During the first 10 days, mobbers, with blackened faces, came every day, cursing and swearing like demons from the pit, and declaring that they would kill that old Mormon preacher. At times like these, when human nature quailed, I felt the power of God upon me to that degree that I could stand before them fearless, and although a woman and alone, those demons in human shape had to succumb, for there was a power with me that they knew not of. During these days of mobocratic violence, I would sometimes hide my husband in the house, and sometimes in the woods, covering him with leaves. And thus was I constantly harassed, until the mob finally left us, with the understanding that we should leave in the spring. About the middle of February, we started for Quincy, Illinois. Arriving there, we tarried for a short time, and thence moved to Nauvoo.